Hey there, this is Dr. Lyle Burgoon with the Raptor Farm and Talks. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the consensus key characteristics approach, and specifically as they apply to carcinogens and endocrine disruptors. Now, if you're watching this, you may already be familiar with the consensus key characteristics approach, or the consensus key characteristics of carcinogens and the consensus key characteristics of endocrine disruptors. But for those of you who aren't, I just want to give you a quick background on what the key characteristics approach is really about. So, the whole idea of this is kind of interesting. A group of scientists get together. Typically, this was through an IARC process, or it was sponsored by IARC. Uh, that doesn't really matter that much. What matters is this group of scientists get together and they kind of do the same thing we do in machine learning. They start looking for what are the characteristics of carcinogens or endocrine disruptors. And in both cases, they turned this into a list of 10 key characteristics. And like I said, it's very similar to how we do machine learning, right? So, for instance, if I were to build let's say, a QSAR model for, I don't know, reproductive toxicology, let's say, I'm going to try to identify those structural characteristics about the chemicals that have some kind of reproductive toxicology impact in order to build a machine learning model that can predict this based off of structures. Now, what you might recognize from a structural standpoint is that's kind of hard for these really high tier endpoints, right? Like reproductive toxicology. There's a lot of endpoints that fall within reproductive toxicology. So finding structures that are going to tell you, yes, this is it, is going to be kind of hard. This is a slightly different problem here. They aren't looking for structural characteristics of carcinogens or endocrine disruptors. They're looking at it more from a mode of action standpoint. So they're asking, what are the mode of action characteristics that are common amongst carcinogens and that are common amongst endocrine disruptors? And important to note, they're not mixing the two. It's not like they're saying endocrine disruptors and carcinogens share mode of action. No, these are two separate things, and they were two separate papers. We're just critiquing the overall approach to it. The overall approach was the same, which was to say, what are these mode of action elements that are the same for carcinogens? What are the mode of action elements that are the same for endocrine disruptors? And they, like I said, they break it down into 10 parts. So, and for, just so we're all on the same page here, carcinogens are going to be chemicals that generally cause cancer. And then endocrine disruptors are going to be chemicals that are impacting the endocrine system. Typically, we're speaking specifically about the estrogen pathways, the testosterone pathways, and the thyroid hormone pathways. So chemicals that are going to modulate those pathways in some way. Those are going to be the endocrine disruptors. So you're probably asking, so what's the problem? This sounds like a great idea. This sounds like something that's really, really good. I'm not going to address some of the issues that others have noted. Rick Becker has and his team put together an interesting piece on some of the challenges and the problems with the characteristics approach for carcinogens. Chris Borgert put together a paper focused on endocrine receptors. And I don't want to rehash what they're talking about. What we're going to talk about here is actually we're looking at this more from an epistemological standpoint or a philosophy of science standpoint. So epistemology is the philosophical study of thought, reasoning, logic, etc. So we're going to take more of that kind of a standpoint and approach to this, because what you'll find is the key characteristics approach, I guess the nicest way to say it is they're unscientific. They violate a lot of the laws of the philosophy of science as set out by Karl Popper that modern day science is based on. And they're actually illogical. And we'll get into that in a little bit here. I mentioned Karl Popper, so let's start there. What are these criteria for scientific studies, or what makes science science versus not science? That was one of the things that Karl Popper, the philosopher of science, was really trying to understand. And he is the key influence for much of how we talk about science today. The criteria are, first off, science is based on deductive logic, okay, and not inductive logic. So deductive logic is where we have factual statements And so, like, you know, I have bread. Bread is yummy. That's probably not the best example, is it? No. Um, I have a sandwich. Yeah, this is probably better. I have a sandwich, and bread is yummy, therefore the sandwich is yummy. Yeah, that's kind of a deductive statement. So if each one of those, if the first two elements are both true, then you know that the third point is true. That's how deductive logic is put together. You're going from these factual statements that can be true or false, and then you know that the last part is true or false based off of those. And there are better examples out there. I should probably come up with a better one sooner. The the second part of this, though, is that theories must be falsifiable. So if you have a theory of something and it is always true, then it's not falsifiable because there aren't cases where it could be false. And that really isn't science. That's pseudoscience at best. Um, and then the third criterion is that we need to be, as a scientific enterprise, we need to be going forth and trying to disprove our theories, not prove them correct. We're not trying to affirm them, because when we start affirming things, um, we get into issues where we aren't looking for the exceptions to the theory. And we'll talk a little bit more about this in a couple slides. But just remember that the goal of science is not to prove our theories correct. It's not to prove our hypotheses that we're trying to find in our papers. It's not trying to prove that. It's trying to disprove it. So we're trying to really severely test, as Popper would say, our theories and our hypotheses that we're chasing after. And corollaries to this is that theories that are made or modified to be compatible with all the observations about a subject are not scientific because they cannot be falsified. And that's really where Popper starts criticizing later Marxist thought, for instance, where Marxism started as a theory, actually, that could be tested and falsified. And later on, Marxism started moving away from that into trying to explain everything, where Marxism could never be wrong. And that's actually kind of where Popper started these ideas about what is science versus what is not science, was in his studies of Marxism and also some psychodynamic thought as well. Coming back to what we're dealing with here, really, I want to address the problem with induction. So inductive reasoning is reasoning. An example here on the slide is all observed instances of A have been B in the past. Therefore, the next instance of A shall also be B. And Hume, the famous philosopher, was among the first, not the first. The ancient Greeks actually addressed this before Hume did. But Hume is the one who got popularized later on, that you can't have inductive reasoning and give it the same stature as you would deductive reasoning, because inductive reasoning at the end of the day could be wrong. There's a probability that it is wrong. And so we can't infer that it's always going to be right. Part of the issue with inductive logic is the fact that it is actually circular logic. And when you break it down and you get all the way down to the nitty gritty, inductive logic requires what's called the uniformity principle, that all things are true from the training set or the past are going to be true for future inferences. And we know this doesn't work, right? Anybody who plays the stock market knows that past performance of a stock is not indicative of future performance. I mean, they tell you that all the time in the advertisements because they have to. The Securities and Exchange Commission says, "Thou shalt say this, otherwise we're going to punish you." So we know this, and we know that just because it's cloudy outside doesn't mean it's always going to rain, right? So we understand this nuance. The issue becomes when we start using inductive reasoning in dogmatic ways, we will get into trouble. And so from a scientific standpoint, Popper was very quick, as was Hume. We're very quick to say you can't use inductive logic in the area of science. It just doesn't work. In terms of fallacies, the fallacy that comes most to mind when we're dealing with inductive reasoning is actually the fallacy of hasty generalization or stereotyping. if you ever looked at someone and said, oh my gosh, look at how poorly dressed they are, they must be a horrible human being. Yes, that is stereotyping, right? So stereotyping is bad for the most part. It leads us to hasty generalizations, which is where we are going to make some kind of judgment on something very quickly without really thinking about it. Stereotyping has some evolutionary good. It has a lot of evolutionary bad as well. If you read the psychology literature, there's some interesting thoughts that, we go to hasty generalization because if it's not something that we need to think about a lot and it's not a very serious issue, then this is actually kind of a good thing to do, right? Um, hmm. If, for instance, you don't like egg salad, I hate egg salad. I hate it, right? I know that there's probably no egg salad sandwich in the world that I am going to like. I've had so many that I hate. I've just now come to the hasty generalization. I'm going to hate everybody's egg salad sandwich. I don't care if Gordon Ramsay makes it himself. I probably am not going to like it because I do not like those combinations of flavors. Now, could I be wrong? I could be completely wrong. Maybe Gordon Ramsay makes the absolute best egg salad sandwich in the world. In which case, if someone were to convince me to try it, I would probably, if I trusted the person. If I didn't trust the person, I probably wouldn't do that. But I have this hasty generalization about egg salad sandwiches. If I see them at the store, if I see them at the airport, if I see them at the convenience store, not that I would eat much food from a convenience store unless it's Sheetz, I'm just not going to do it, right? It's a hasty generalization. The challenge is that the consensus key characteristics approaches are actually based on induction. You probably saw that coming, didn't you? If I spend all that time talking about inductive logic and telling you how bad it is, probably the key characteristics approaches are based on induction. Yeah, they are. So you saw the previous argument, and here it is for the key characteristics stated in the same way that we would state inductive logic. All observed instances of cancer-causing or EDC chemicals, EDC being endocrine disrupting chemicals, have at least one key characteristic. That is a rule, by the way, in both papers. If you meet just one of the key characteristics of the 10, then they consider you to be either a carcinogen, if you're using the key characteristics of carcinogens, or an endocrine disruptor, if you're using the key characteristics of endocrine disruption. All you have to meet is just one of the characteristics. You don't have to meet all 10. You just have to meet one. Now, so therefore, here's the therefore part. The next cancer-causing or EDC chemical shall exhibit at least one key characteristic. This is inductive logic. So, like I said, exhibiting one key characteristic is necessary and sufficient in this classification scheme. That's it. You just need to meet one. Now, it doesn't matter if you had to meet one or if you had to meet all 10. Either way, it's all based on induction. And that's the problem. It's based on inductive logic. And so, as we know, we can't have science based on inductive logic. When we start making these inferences, that means that there are going to be a lot of cases where this may not be true. So, I want to call your attention to the classic. If you haven't taken an epistemology course, then you may not have heard of this, but you may have in your readings, which is the problem with induction can be summed up using swans. That's right. There was a conjecture a long time ago that all swans are white. All swans are white. In fact, I tested this with my kids the other day. I said, so, are all swans white? And my son, who is quite the skeptic, looked at me as like, the fact that you're asking me this question leads me to believe no. My daughter, on the other hand, was, I've seen swans. All the swans I've seen are white. Yeah, all swans are white. Yeah, that's true. Turns out there are black swans. And there are places where you can find black swans, chiefly in Asia. So, it is incorrect to say that all swans are white, right? Evidence of a single black swan is sufficient to demonstrate the argument is illogical. So, when we start talking about all observed instances of cancer-causing or EDC chemicals have at least one key characteristic, therefore the next cancer-causing or ADC chemical shall also exhibit at least one key characteristic. That is induction. That's false, because we can find cases to demonstrate that that is false. And because we can find cases that demonstrate that that is false, then it's not really safe to use those key characteristics, is it? Because one single chemical violates the theory that is sufficient to make it falsifiable. Generally speaking, when we come to hasty generalization, it tends to get perpetuated through confirmation bias. And it appears, there's an appearance that the authors of the key characteristics, the consensus key characteristics approach, did not attempt to severely test and disprove their theories. Instead, it appears that they were going off of confirmation bias. So what do I mean by this? What I mean is they were choosing examples that they know are carcinogens, that they believe are carcinogens, and examples that they believe are endocrine disrupting chemicals. And they're using those examples to then come up with these 10 key characteristics. But in science, as Karl Popper was really pushing, we need to do what's called severe testing. Severe testing is not sufficient to test something by just looking for confirmation of our biases or confirmation of our hypothesis or our theory. If all we do is just try to confirm our theories and our hypotheses, what are we actually doing? We're not trying to disprove anything. We're just looking for cases that say, yep, this is true. Yep, this is true. Yep, this is true. But that's not really a severe test. A severe test, and that is what is required by science to actually be science, is for us to try to disprove our theories and our hypotheses. So rather than looking for the cases that prove our point, we need to be looking for the cases that do not prove our point. And this is something where people who are trained as analysts in the intelligence community, for instance, are constantly being reminded of. You may have a pet theory. That has now become your bias. You need to hold your bias in check. And the easiest way to hold your bias in check is to find examples that are going to be counter to your preferred theory or preferred hypothesis, whatever your bias is. You're looking for ways of disproving it. And when you've tried to disprove it and there is no other evidence to disprove it, that is a pretty good indication that what you're dealing with is a pretty solid theory or hypothesis, or maybe we just are at a point in time where we can't properly test it. That happens a lot in theoretical physics, for instance. So the issue is that the consensus key characteristics authors, they didn't actually provide evidence that was counter to what they were trying to say. So they didn't actually severely test it. And because they didn't severely test it, it's very ripe for confirmation bias and hasty generalization. So here's a case study. Myself and Chris Borgert, we decided we need to severely test this. We need to severely test the key characteristics approach. And we are looking at, like I said, the consensus key characteristics for carcinogens and the consensus key characteristics for endocrine disruptors. Our first case study is linoleic acid. We actually searched, so we did what they said. The authors state that you should search the literature using the key characteristic statements. And that's what we did. We searched PubMed, linoleic acid, induces oxidative stress for the carcinogens. And for the endocrine disruptors, we looked at, we searched the string interacts with a hormone receptor. And what's interesting is linoleic acid induces apoptosis in breast cancer cells. It may be protective against certain cancers, and there's no evidence of adverse endocrine action. We found tons of reports using those search terms. But like I said, when we started digging into it, what we found was that linoleic acid is not a carcinogen. It's probably the opposite. And linoleic acid doesn't actually interact with the estrogen receptor per se, its affinity for the estrogen receptor is actually extremely, extremely low. It doesn't like binding to the estrogen receptor. And it's what it does in breast cancer cells is kind of counter to what estrogen would be doing in an ER positive breast cancer. So we tried to find evidence and we couldn't. I mean, we basically severely tested what they have here. I did the same thing with water, ATP, adenosine triphosphate, which is the energy currency of our cells, right? Calcium, sodium, glutathione. I could have done oxygen. I meant to do oxygen. I'll be honest. I meant to do oxygen. I forgot. Because oxygen is another one. And here we're looking at chemicals required for life. And what you see is that across these chemicals, we have evidence that they fall within certain key characteristics. And I didn't list all of them. Some of these hit multiple of the consensus key characteristics, which is also interesting. But none of these would we say are carcinogens. In fact, we would say that these are all required for life. So what we did was we severely tested the theory put forth, or the hypothesis. I guess, well, it depends on who you talk. Some people probably say it's a theory because they feel it has been accepted because it's their consensus process. Other people would say it's merely a hypothesis. I'm kind of in that camp. I'd say this is merely a hypothesis. But either way, it doesn't really matter. Chris and I severely tested this. And what we found is that the consensus key characteristics approach fails because it would call chemicals required for life to be carcinogens and endocrine disruptors. As a result of this, it's very clear to me and to Chris, and I hope it's clear to you now as well. The consensus key characteristics approach is actually unreliable for risk assessment. Again, using Karl Popper's criteria, and which is, like I said, the foundation of how we do modern science today. What we've demonstrated is that the consensus key characteristics approach is circular reasoning. It's circular logic. It's based on inductive logic. The consensus key characteristics approach is actually illogical. When you put it within the deductive framework, it fails. It's false. Therefore, it is illogical. And the consensus key characteristics approach does not hold true and is inconsistent with our current knowledge of the science around chemicals. Therefore, it is clear to us, and I hope it is clear to you as well, that the consensus key characteristics approach is unreliable for use in hazard and risk assessment. So thank you for listening. And, if you have questions, I got my email there. Feel free to email me. You can find me on LinkedIn as well. Feel free to drop me a line there. I'm more than happy to talk about this. We are putting together a paper to also get these ideas out a little bit further. You can also find me at various places. The Toxic Truth blog is a wonderful blog that I put together. Of course, I'm going to say it's wonderful. I'm biased. Well, there's my bias. And, that's more aimed for a technical audience. And then we have the podcast, the Critical Science Podcast at critscipod.com. You can get it anywhere that you get your podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, etc. Please give a listen if you have feedback on the blog or the podcast. Of course, email me. You got my email right there. Thanks very much. And it's been a pleasure. Have a great day.